It struck me here last night that there are two banners in this church up front. I'd just like to point out that the one higher up there is the one of Blessed Pope John Paul II. Ted may replace him one day, but not yet. I was struck by the one sentence of the earlier reading. The life and death of each one of us has its influence on others. And listening to Jim talk about the Father Ted that he knew, and all of us bringing our own memories of that same Father Ted, know that he had an influence on each one of us. Fractions are important to children. I'm 4.5. If Father Ted was to come back to one of the children he loved to talk to in the grade schools, he might say, I was 97.75 when I died. 2.25 years short of a century. What a life. Many of you have asked yesterday and over the days since we heard of his death, when did he come to Canada? Well, he arrived here in October 1971. So he was here for 39.5 years. And prior to that, he had spent 29.25 years in Kenya, from January 1942 to Easter 1971. Well, so much for fractions. In that year, 1971, before Easter, he was declared an undesirable alien by President Jomo Kenyatta and put on the next plane back to Ireland. In Toronto, he would go to jail rather than back down on his convictions. The Kenyan expulsion came about when he was deeply upset at the disparaging way the president talked about the missionaries. In Ted's eyes, they had laid the foundation of education in Kenya. So, Ted, being Ted, wrote a personal letter resenting the president's offensive references. And he delivered it to the president through Mr. Kenyatta's mother-in-law, one of Ted's parishioners. Next morning, the cook came into his room. Father, the provincial commissioner is outside and wants to see you. About 3 p.m., the cook came in again. Father, the police are here. Ted packed pajamas, shaving gear, and a Bible in a small bag and went with them. They kept him for a while, and then there was an evening visit from the Minister for External Affairs, deportation. And there was a final farewell to those few who saw him off. After 30 years in Kenya, I am leaving. I am taking with me my pajamas, a shaving set, and a Bible. I hope everyone who comes to your country puts in as much and takes out as little. Good night. I think that was the Ted Colleton we came to know. So 6 months later, did Canadian immigration know who it was letting in? We are here today because this man, this priest, this Spiritan meant a great deal to us. He was a man of many words. Yes, spoken words. His sermons, his retreats, his talks, his stories, his jokes, his convictions. Written words. His columns in the interim, his 3 books, his countless letters. Many words. But above all, a man whose words became flesh. He lived what he proclaimed. And of course, maybe the most striking example of that, he tells about it in his book. Having preached and talked and written about the evil of abortion, I felt I had to take direct action. So he put a padlock on the rear gate through which the women and girls entered the Morgentaler premises in Toronto. And this led to the first of at least a dozen arrests, 4 trials, and 6 weeks in the Mimico Correctional Institute. Mimico Correctional Center. Correctional Center? Ted was incorrigible. But if you read the little page or 2 that he has about time there, his writings about life in prison were graphic, unsettling, and stomach-turning. He was no longer father. He was Colleton. Colleton, visit. And he said they used exactly the same tone they would use in ordering a dog to lie down. For Ted, not to be called father was probably one of the greatest injuries you could inflict on him. Ted needed people. His life had a tremendous influence on others. But he would be the last to proclaim any great personal holiness. And I don't know who he said it to, but I know he did say, "Don't canonize me. They'll stop praying for me then." And towards the end, he wrote it in the book, and it came to be a few years later. "If it is the good Lord's will that I take refuge in a wheelchair, I shall still be able to pray, and I have a lot of praying to make up." That wheelchair praying took place in Canada. He never got back to Ireland. Maybe it was because Ireland was beginning to have enough troubles of its own without having Ted to deal with. But looking back and coming out of that opening sentence, the life and death of each one of us has its influence on others. Father Ted was a man of tremendous convictions about human life and about his cherished priesthood. I'm sure that many grade school children went home and told their parents, "You know, we had this priest in school today. He told jokes and did neat card tricks." But the high school students and his many adult audiences laughed at the jokes, but by the time he left them, he had given them much food for thought. And so I'd like to end up with what he wrote. "I cannot think of any aspect of my life which I would substantially change, and certainly not my priesthood. I have daily stood at the altar of God and offered the holy sacrifice of the Mass, raised my hand in absolution over more repentant sinners than I could ever count, poured the waters of baptism over the heads of babies without number, preached the gospel in Ireland, England, Africa, the United States, and Canada, and anointed the foreheads of those who were within minutes of meeting God face to face. And although I was only the instrument of the church, it is consoling to realize in the evening of life that I was chosen to be such an instrument. In this period of church history, when the glory of the priesthood has been somewhat overshadowed by the clouds of scandal and doubt, I want to affirm this fact: if I had another life to live, I'd do it again.